Up next, I have a good friend of mine and colleague, April Burt, and her title of her presentation is Island Ecosystem Management Challenges, a Practitioner's Perspective. April is a conservation scientist, now completing her PhD at the University of Oxford. And previously, she has spent over 7 years working in the islands of Seychelles, working on Curieuse with Global Vision International, on Cousin with Nature Seychelles, and on Aldabra of the Seychelles Islands Foundation. April describes herself as a generalist conservationist whose research focuses on informing and improving the management of ecosystems or species. Thank you very much for making time, April, and please take it away.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm delighted to present for the very first time the findings of a series of interviews I conducted with conservation and management practitioners to investigate the barriers to effective island ecosystem management. I'm going to jump straight in. The reason I'm focusing on islands is because they are so important. Islands support around 20% of global biodiversity, but they're also where about 80% of all known extinctions have occurred, so making them some of the most important, but also the most vulnerable ecosystems on the planet. And the biodiversity that islands support provides huge amounts of ecosystem services to communities worldwide. So countries around the world have recognised the need to reduce loss by committing to achieve the HE biodiversity targets and the Sustainable Development Goals. But the 2010 and now the 2020 targets were not met. So it's clear from this that conservation and management needs to become more effective, especially for island ecosystems. And then the other reason that I am focused so much on island ecosystem management, like Jeremy said, I was very lucky to spend over 7 years living and working on conservation islands in the Seychelles, alongside many of the Seychelles' finest conservation warriors on a wide range of projects. And those of you who work on the islands will know that it's not very often that you get off the islands to meet other practitioners from other organisations and other islands. But then on the occasions when we did get to mingle, we would always talk about the work we had in common and the challenges that we faced. And it always turned out that we were often dealing with the same challenges and the same issues. And this is really what motivated me to go down this avenue of research. So to get to the bottom of the issues impacting conservation and management of island ecosystems, I wanted to give practitioners the opportunity to share information about their work and the day-to-day challenges they're facing. So we conducted interviews with island ecosystem management practitioners in the Western Indian Ocean region to compile the first in-depth case study on these barriers from a practitioner's perspective. We aim to explore the issues influencing the ability of practitioners to meet management objectives and turn data into useful information for both management and for policy. So specifically, the aims for the interviews were to identify the barriers to more effective island ecosystem management and where these barriers existed and what caused them. We also wanted to generate ideas to strengthen and support island ecosystem management and determine the priority areas for a follow-up survey to really quantify these issues on a global scale. So of the 68 practitioners that we invited for interview, we were able to conduct 32 interviews across 4 countries in the Western Indian Ocean region. As you can see from the table, most of these were conducted in the Seychelles, but we also managed to do La Réunion, Mauritius, Rodrigues, and in Madagascar. The role or seniority level of interviewees varied across management levels, so from government officials right down to field staff. And then also the place of work varied as well, from like privately owned islands, several conservation organisations, and then also researchers from educational institutes that work closely with organisations on conservation and management projects. The interviews used what is called a semi-structured approach, and this is really most appropriate when you roughly know the topics that you wish to cover, but you cannot really predict the likely responses in order to create a questionnaire. So it's like a scoping exercise. So the interview was a combination of open-ended questions and then more direct questions, and then organic questions that arose throughout the interviewee responses. For example, I would start the interview by asking them to tell me about your role in island ecosystem management, and then continued as outlined in this diagram, prompting the interviewee for additional information or particulars where necessary, and then adding follow-up questions to new ideas that the interviewees introduced. So then what do you end up with? You end up with a long transcript from each interview. So we're dealing with words here, we're not dealing with numbers. So we're working with qualitative data, and this was a really steep learning curve for me because I've never done this social science before, but it was also a really interesting process. The word cloud that you can see was made using all the transcripts from the interviews. And from this jumble of words, I needed to create data and information. So to do this, we used a technique called coding to sort and categorize the qualitative data. And so firstly, where an interviewee described a barrier, this was coded as a barrier. So then we had a list of barriers, and then next to the barrier, we listed the quotes associated with that barrier as a kind of validation process. So for example, one of the barriers described by practitioner was government capacity issues. And then the quote was, the government departments do not have the capacity for visualizing research strategy. It's often the blind leading the blind. Another example is personalities and personal relationships interfere with meeting objectives. So the quote is often, people politics come before conservation. So this is just a subset of the barriers. And from the transcripts, we coded about 35 individual barriers. And while reviewing all these barriers, it became clear that they could also be categorized based on their provenance. So at which level they most frequently arise within the management system. So each barrier was therefore coded most logically to either national level, for example, like policy and legislation type barriers, or organization level, for example, staffing and resources, or down at site and project level, so things like data management and data analysis. And the barriers could also be grouped by topic. So here in this diagram, the barriers are separated into their themes or topics, and each box, the size of the box, represents the number of barriers within that theme. And as you can see, the majority of barriers described by practitioners occurred at organization level. And within those themes, most of those barriers fell within collaboration or staffing or knowledge share communication forum themes. And then at site project level, a lot of the barriers described were about data analysis or data management. And at national level, we're looking at policy and legislation or leadership and coordination type barriers. So now we really are starting to get some tangible results from the interviews that we did. But we wanted to take the analysis a bit further than just defining the barriers. And so we also went through the transcripts and assigned one or more causes to each of the barriers. So for example, here in the table, no time for analysis. Well, that's caused by resource limitations, such as personnel. And also it's not an integral part of the job description in many cases, so it's therefore not prioritized, or there's always other things to do. A lack of national research strategy was another barrier that was described. and it's caused by a low capacity, scientific capacity in government, and a low research is a low priority for government. And these were things that were identified by practitioners. So overall, we did this and 6 major causal links emerged. So first I want you to look under the cause list, and these major causal links were limited capacity, poor leadership, lack of government coordination, limited resources, lack of incentive, and individual and personal issues. So when we bring together the barriers from each level and link them to their main causes, we can start to interpret these results. So barriers exist at each level, and our study doesn't quantify how frequently the barriers occur, but the type of barriers at each level. And as you can see, the barriers in blue, the national level barriers, if you follow them across to the causes side, you can see they're most closely linked to or caused by limited capacity, limited resources, and lack of government coordination. And then if you look at the project level, project and site level, so the bright green barriers, these are mainly linked to poor leadership and limited capacity and resources. And then the green organisation level barriers are linked to all of those major causes, especially to lack of government coordination and limited resources. So why is it so important to define these barriers and their causes? Well, by defining them and presenting them through systematic research, we can bring them forward and try to bridge them. Some barriers have very simple fixes, some require individual organisations to act, and others require national level action and coordination to tackle them. And within this study, multiple barriers existed for all the practitioners, and fixing one of these barriers doesn't necessarily fix the entire problem. For example, if a practitioner in the field is struggling with data management and then a solution is implemented, there is still the next hurdle along, such as data analysis or report writing. And so if practitioners fall at the first hurdles, they have very little chance of achieving their ultimate objectives further down the line. So the conclusion really is that the ability to be self-critical of our work is really an important first step to bridging these barriers. And it's really important also to recognise that despite the barriers outlined by this study, there is a huge amount of positive and successful conservation work being carried out by conservation and management organisations. It's also important to acknowledge that some organisations have already recognised certain barriers and are proactively dealing with them. So, for example, by creating data management positions or developing collaborations with research institutes to enable data analysis. Other organisations have consistently led annual forums for knowledge and data share without any additional funding to do so. And many organisations have increased their efforts towards sharing site-specific research findings. So to end with, the interviews that we've done and the results that we've generated are really the first piece in the puzzle. And to take the study a step further, we have developed an online questionnaire. The online questionnaire was built using the responses from the interviews and then used to expand on the priority areas that we identified. We established that capacity is a big cause to many of these barriers, but we need to really establish exactly which types of capacity are needed. We also wanted to broaden the survey to practitioners worldwide and have therefore launched the survey in 8 languages. And then lastly, and most importantly, having established and quantified the main barriers, we need to identify which solutions will have the most impact, so we can really try and improve our efforts towards effective island ecosystem management. So I wanted to say a big thank you to all those who took their precious time to participate in the interviews and also all my collaborators and mentors through this process. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, April. That was an incredible presentation. And as you said already, the first time people are seeing this, so this is amazing to see. And yeah, it's just the beginning of the puzzle. And I particularly liked your graphic heading to the sun and the hurdles in between. So without wasting more time on my side, we have a couple of questions. So first up, we have Mark, who's asking, while it's still early days of discovery rather than action, what would you say is the main focus of this management that faces these barriers? So controlling for human impact, remedying human impact, remedying natural changes.
Yeah, so it's important to kind of acknowledge the different objectives between management organizations. So for example, some of the organizations, their mandate is just to protect an island, so enforcing that protection, whereas others are much more active management, so restoration, etc. And so there's a broad range of you know, what management means, and that is really important to acknowledge, and we've built that into the online survey, so that's more categorized when we go into more detail. I hope that answers that question.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, and another one already, so from Katie. So she's saying, thanks, April, really great work and very interesting to see for the region. Are these data / findings published anywhere? Where could we see the results? If not, it would be great to chat further with you, please. So yeah, we already got somebody interested in that. I also really like you highlighted many of the strengths that are observed too.
Yeah, I think obviously there are a lot of strengths, and I don't want to detract from that, because, you know, having also worked in Seychelles, I see all the amazing work that's going on and all the achievements. So not to detract from that, but to recognise that things could be better. And yes, so this data is in the process of being written into a manuscript, but I'm very aware that publishing these findings is nowhere near enough to actually make any difference. And so we need to go beyond publication and really engage, present these results as much as possible, and really start discussions with organisations and of course government departments where necessary. So yeah, next steps, there's a lot of them.
Excellent. I mean, yeah, I mean, this is exactly what you're doing in terms of presenting this data already, and we look forward to future presentations, that's for sure. I'm going to put in another question quickly from Jean-Pierre. Good job in categorizing the barriers. How would you compare the situation in Seychelles to other countries or small island states?
Yeah, that's also really important, because you know, most of the interviews I did, although there were a few from Mauritius and elsewhere, most of them were from Seychelles. So it wasn't really possible to do any comparisons nation by nation with the interviews, but with the online survey, of course, we are doing it at a global scale. It's already been launched, so we have about 140 respondents already from about 35 different island nations around the world. So my aim is to then try and get as many practitioners worldwide, and then we can start looking at that from region to region and seeing whether there are differences nationally or regionally in the barriers that are faced.
Excellent answer to that. And and unfortunately, we do have some technical difficulties with our next presenter, but that maybe gives us a little bit more time to ask questions now. So I'm going to give room for about 2-3 more questions, try and keep it to about 3-4 minutes now. So I'll wait, but while I wait, I wanted to ask April, in terms of, you know, you kind of went through the collaborating, data analysis and policy legislation. This was at different levels in that sense. And obviously, I guess these things interact and overlap to some extent. So I'm wondering, you know, is there a particular thing that certain organizations should be focusing on more first, or, you know, that when you deal with this, it, you know, bottlenecks, there's not a bottleneck here, it basically carries on through. So I'm wondering, are there strategic points of intervention with some of these barriers, basically? Maybe it's too early to ask,
yeah,
but I'm wondering.
You're right, it's interesting to try and sort the barriers into what could be a fix that would fix more things. And I think one of the big themes that came through, especially at organisation level, was collaboration. And so I remember specifically one of the quotes from the interviews was, "We're all doing different things on different islands with no idea what everyone else is doing, using sometimes the same methods, sometimes different methods, getting the same data, but not sharing it." And that kind of summarizes why I wanted to do this study in the first place, because obviously there is collaboration and there are forums like this one for sharing information, but it's not standardized as much as it could be. So I think, making sure that people aren't doing the same things or, reinventing the wheel, and that, if everyone's collecting seabird data, for example, in the same way, then one organization can take on the analysis and reporting of that, which takes it off everyone else's hands, saving resources and money. And, that's kind of what we want to aim for.
Excellent. Yeah. And I think we do still have some time. So I'm not seeing other questions. I can ask more questions, but I actually rather maybe put it back to you, April, if there are particular sides of things you'd want to maybe focus on more, that, everything is condensed in these presentations. So maybe you have more thoughts to share first.
Well, obviously, I think for a lot of the people that did the interviews with me, there were 35 barriers that came out of that, and they did vary a lot. So I can probably just go through a few of those just to give you more examples. So with regards to the data management, for example, that included things like poor spreadsheet design, which hindered any kind of data analysis, data loss due to technical failures, data entry errors, leading to, complete confusion over when it gets to the analysis point. Inconsistent methods was also another reason that practitioners couldn't really do any meaningful analysis. And then often this was caused by lack of protocols. So there's not always a set way of doing things. And then low data analysis capacity was also another thing that came up a lot at the site and project level. So one of the things we've built into the online survey is where practitioners can say which specific capacity would be most useful for enhancing their ability to meet their management objectives. And that varies, from things like data analysis all the way through to leadership or GIS skills, or, multiple different things.
And okay, still got some time. So my question would be, just, I'm not seeing any from the floor, but I do invite others. What was the most unexpected, or the kind of doing these interviews? What was probably one of the most unexpected things to have learned from this this exercise?
I did have some. You go into this, you're supposed to be completely objective, but it's really difficult, obviously, because you have a reason why you're doing the surveys in the first place. So I kind of knew from my own experience what kind of barriers that I faced, and it was very much like, well, there wasn't a protocol, so the methods drifted, or there wasn't any time for analysis. And I wasn't really expecting all of the national level barriers, and I found those really interesting. So like a lack of national research strategy. For me, that was a really key one, because if you did have that, then everyone could be working from the same page, and it would be like an overarching goal or way of measuring achievements as well. Although having said that, obviously SEICAT now is very much doing that in some ways, because they're only funding research that is informing the blue economy and climate change adaptation. And, so it is, in a way, it's a much more structured approach. And I really admire that. And there's lots of good research coming out of that SEICAT initiative. So I think that's a real positive.
Excellent. So it sounds like we do have our next presenter on the line. And you've just answered Samantha's question. So I just want to say thank you so much, April, for sharing those first glimpse of that puzzle that you're putting together and taking apart. And yeah, I'll basically thank you.
No problem.